In the humid heat of a southern afternoon, the widow emerged from her home, a figure of composure and quiet authority, moving with deliberate purpose across the veranda that overlooked her plantation. The sun's rays glinted off the worn wooden floorboards, revealing patterns of age and care, shadows cast long and deliberate as if to mark the passage of time and hint at the weight of decisions that had come before. Her face, pale but resolute, reflected both grief and calculation, a mixture of personal loss and strategic ambition that had begun to reshape not only her household but the broader social landscape. The town, a small cluster of buildings along dusty roads and cobbled paths, seemed to pause in awareness as she emerged, her presence commanding attention without uttering a single word. Local families, long accustomed to routine, felt the subtle shift in social energy, sensing that the widow's decisions were about to ripple outward, disrupting patterns that had been established over decades. Her late husband's passing had left her in a position of both vulnerability and potential, an unexpected authority that demanded careful navigation. She had spent the first weeks in private, attending to her grief while simultaneously studying ledgers, letters, and the intricacies of the social networks around her. Every interaction, every observation was catalogued with a meticulous eye, creating a mental map of influence and opportunity. In these private hours, she weighed alliances, rivalries, and the nuances of loyalty, understanding that any miscalculation could undo the fragile stability she now inherited. The widow's first decisions were subtle yet impactful, touching the household staff, neighbors, and business contacts in ways that went largely unnoticed at first but carried deep consequences. She rearranged responsibilities among her servants, favoring those whose loyalty could be subtly leveraged, while carefully observing those whose reliability remained uncertain. Small changes in household routines, a reassignment of duties, a minor alteration to the daily schedule, the introduction of stricter accountability measures, were executed with precision, ensuring that control was established without overt confrontation. Beyond the confines of her home, her influence extended into the town's social fabric. Invitations to gatherings were strategically extended or withheld, alliances subtly tested, and conversations orchestrated to reveal both ambition and caution among peers. She attended meetings at the church, the marketplace, and family estates with a quiet confidence, observing, listening, and influencing without overt assertion. Each smile, gesture, and comment was calculated, a deliberate part of a broader strategy to secure her position and expand her influence. The widow's presence was particularly felt among the elite families of the town, those who had previously operated with unchallenged authority. They sensed a new force emerging, one that could destabilize long-held hierarchies and create new alignments of power. Whispers began to circulate, speculation about her intentions, her strategies, and the subtle maneuvers that seemed to shape events around her. While some admired her intelligence and foresight, others regarded her with suspicion, uncertain of the implications of her decisions and the limits of her ambition. As the weeks progressed, the widow's choices became more pronounced. She began to intervene in matters of property, inheritance, and local commerce, ensuring that her family's assets were protected and, when possible, expanded. Her interventions were never haphazard, each action was measured against a backdrop of observation and understanding of human behavior. The townspeople, though initially unaware of the full scope of her plans, began to notice patterns, certain families rising in influence, disputes resolved in unexpected ways, and subtle shifts in the town's social hierarchy. Rumors of her cutting spread, drawing attention from visitors, distant relatives, and local leaders who sought to understand the source of her growing authority. The widow's mastery lay not only in her ability to make decisions but in her awareness of perception. She understood that power was as much about how one was seen as about the actions themselves. She cultivated an image of composure, generosity, and rationality, masking the strategic intent behind her decisions, allowing admiration and fear to coexist in those who observed her. Her decisions were also informed by a deep understanding of the psychological currents of her community. She anticipated reactions, leveraged insecurities, and guided conversations to ensure that outcomes aligned with her objectives. Minor actions, such as the timing of a social visit or the choice of attire for a gathering, carried subtle messages, signaling both capability and intent. The widow's influence extended to those beyond immediate observation. Merchants, craftsmen, and farmers who interacted with her household found their dealings subtly shaped by her presence. Orders were fulfilled with an eye toward loyalty, payments managed to ensure both compliance and advantage, and favors extended strategically to maintain a network of obligation. Even casual encounters became exercises in social calculation, as the widow monitored responses, gauged attitudes, and refined her approach based on observed behaviors. Her decisions were not limited to the practical or strategic, they also carried moral and social weight. She navigated the complex intersection of grief, personal ambition, and societal expectation, understanding that each choice would resonate emotionally and socially. Some of her interventions were seen as compassionate, providing assistance to neighbors or supporting charitable causes, while others were recognized as assertive, reshaping expectations and challenging established norms. As the weeks turned into months, the widow's decisions began to consolidate her influence, creating a web of relationships, obligations, and perceptions that reinforced her authority. Her strategic vision was evident in both the minutiae of daily interactions and the broader trajectories of social and economic influence. The town itself became a living testament to the subtle power of her choices. Alliances shifted, hierarchies adjusted, and the collective consciousness began to acknowledge a force that was at once invisible and pervasive. Even as admiration and fear coexisted, there was a growing recognition that her influence was deliberate, informed, and inexorably expanding. Yet with each decision, there was also a shadow of tension, a recognition that power, once claimed, required constant vigilance to maintain. The widow understood this implicitly, balancing assertiveness with observation, intervention with restraint, and strategy with the careful cultivation of perception. Her life became a continuous exercise in anticipation, calculation, and execution, with each day offering new opportunities, challenges, and tests of resolve. By the end of this period, the widow had established herself not merely as a figure of grief and status but as a deliberate architect of influence, a master of both social dynamics and human psychology. The town, though initially unaware of the full scope of her capabilities, could no longer ignore her presence. Her decisions, calculated and persistent, had created ripples across every layer of society, reshaping alliances, perceptions, and expectations. In the quiet of her home, she reflected on the outcomes of her actions, reviewing successes, adjusting strategies, and preparing for the next phase of her influence. The balance she had achieved was delicate, yet unmistakable. The widow was no longer a passive observer of the world around her, but an active and deliberate force, shaping reality through a combination of insight, strategy, and audacious decision-making. Every interaction, every choice, and every consequence reinforced the reality that her ambition, grief, and intelligence were inseparable elements of a singular force, one capable of altering the social fabric of the town for years to come. In this quiet mastery of circumstance, the widow's legacy began to take shape, not yet fully visible, but unmistakable in its presence, as the first tremors of her influence began to echo across the town, signaling the emergence of a figure whose decisions would leave an indelible mark on history, memory, and the collective consciousness of a community poised on the edge of transformation. The town in which the widow lived was a place defined by both its physical environment and the invisible threads of social hierarchy that connected its inhabitants. Narrow streets, shaded by ancient oaks and magnolias, wound through clusters of modest homes and grand estates, their facades reflecting the wealth, history, and ambition of those who had lived there for generations. The air was thick with humidity, carrying the scent of freshly tilled fields, cooking fires, and the distant tang of the river that ran through the outskirts of the town. It was a place where everyone knew everyone else, and where every action, word, or gesture could ripple outward, observed and interpreted in countless ways. The widow, newly installed in her position of authority, moved within this intricate tapestry of relationships with careful attention. She had spent months observing, learning the subtleties of the town's social structure, the unspoken codes that govern behavior, and the dynamics of power that existed behind closed doors. Each family had its history, its rivalries, and its alliances, all of which were layered with tradition, expectation, and pride. Her late husband's position had provided her with a foothold in this world, but she quickly understood that inheritance alone would not secure influence. She needed to navigate, manipulate, and subtly reshape the relationships that maintained the town's equilibrium. Markets, church gatherings, and social events offered a theater in which her observational skills could be honed. She noted who deferred to whom, which families carried grudges, and which individuals wielded informal authority through reputation or charisma rather than wealth or position. Conversations were catalogued, gestures memorized, and behaviors analyzed, creating a mental map of influence that extended far beyond her immediate household. The widow's presence in these spaces was deliberate yet unobtrusive. She allowed others to underestimate her, to assume that her youth, widowhood, or gender limited her capacity to shape events. Yet beneath her measured demeanor was a mind continually calculating, anticipating responses, and assessing opportunities for subtle intervention. Even seemingly casual encounters were laden with significance. A nod to one family, a lingering gaze at another, a carefully timed comment during a sermon, all were measured to reinforce relationships, test loyalty, or shift perception. The town's residents, attuned to the rhythms of social life, began to notice subtle changes. Families who had long been considered secure in their influence felt small disruptions in the familiar order. Decisions that had once been predictable now seemed open to negotiation, and the widow's interventions, though quiet, were increasingly felt. She did not act for spectacle, her influence was strategic, often imperceptible to those who were not paying close attention. Even the physical spaces of the town reflected her growing reach. Estates that had been rigidly divided along familial lines experienced minor adjustments in social access, seating arrangements at gatherings, and the distribution of responsibilities that subtly altered perceptions of status and authority. Her awareness of these spatial dynamics allowed her to manage influence in ways that were both tangible and psychological, reinforcing her presence without overt confrontation. Within households, she observed patterns of obedience, affection, and fear, noting which individuals were most easily guided and which required more nuanced approaches. By understanding domestic hierarchies, she could predict responses, shape alliances, and manipulate outcomes that would reinforce her authority. Town meetings and church services became arenas for quiet observation. She noted who spoke and who remained silent, who deferred and who challenged, and how reputation intersected with behavior. These gatherings provided not only information but also opportunities for intervention, a well-timed question, a subtle expression of approval or disapproval, a gesture that shifted attention. Each calculated move strengthened her understanding of the town's intricate social mechanics. Her interactions were guided by an acute awareness of perception. The widow knew that power was not merely about action but about how action was received, interpreted, and remembered. She cultivated an image of composure, rationality, and moral integrity, allowing her strategic maneuvers to unfold beneath the radar of suspicion while simultaneously commanding respect and attention. In the market, her dealings with merchants were equally deliberate. She observed supply chains, gauged reliability, and tested loyalties, ensuring that economic influence complemented her social authority. Orders and transactions were used as instruments of subtle control, rewarding obedience and caution, while discouraging dissent or overreach. News and information flowed through the town in predictable yet manipulable ways. The widow monitored gossip, stories, and casual commentary, understanding how perception shaped opinion. She occasionally contributed to these narratives, planting hints or subtle interpretations that reinforced her position, while leaving enough ambiguity to maintain intrigue and uncertainty. Her awareness extended to emerging events beyond her immediate observation. Regional developments, political shifts, and economic fluctuations were studied with care, and she anticipated their potential impact on local alliances, reputation, and opportunity. She integrated this knowledge into her strategy, ensuring that her actions aligned with both immediate and long-term objectives. Families that had long been considered untouchable were subtly challenged, their influence adjusted by her interventions. Invitations, social positioning, and access to information were carefully calibrated to reward loyalty, test resilience, and consolidate her presence. Even those who outwardly opposed her influence found themselves subtly maneuvered into positions that reinforced her authority. Her understanding of human behavior extended to emotional intelligence. She observed fear, ambition, pride, and envy, using these emotions as instruments to guide decisions and interactions. By anticipating responses to social stimuli, she could craft actions that produced desired outcomes, often without direct confrontation. In private, she maintained meticulous records, notes, and observations, refining her strategies and preparing for contingencies. Every interaction was analyzed, every outcome assessed, and every perception managed to ensure that her influence grew steadily, even if imperceptibly. The widow's integration into the town was not instantaneous, it required patience, observation, and strategic intervention. Over time, however, her presence became a force that could not be ignored. The subtle recalibration of social norms, the careful manipulation of perception, and the strategic engagement with individuals and families ensured that her influence extended far beyond her immediate household. Even as the town appeared unchanged to casual observers, beneath the surface, the social landscape was shifting, guided by her deliberate interventions, strategic calculations, and understanding of human nature. The widow's understanding of the town's fabric was both intricate and comprehensive. She had identified leverage points, vulnerabilities, and opportunities, and she moved with the patience and precision of a strategist who understood that power was as much about timing and perception as it was about action. By carefully observing, calculating, and subtly influencing her surroundings, she became an unseen architect of change, reshaping social dynamics, consolidating loyalty, and asserting her presence in ways that would reverberate through the town for years to come. Her actions were a masterclass in subtlety and strategy, demonstrating that influence could be exerted without overt displays of force, and that the perception of control often mattered as much as its execution. Every glance, gesture, and decision contributed to the slow but steady transformation of the town's social order, establishing the widow as both an observer and a shaper of events. Over the months, the town's residents became increasingly aware, even if unconsciously, that a new force had emerged, one that would alter alliances, behavior, and expectations. The widow's influence was omnipresent yet often invisible, a quiet orchestration of circumstance, perception, and interaction, ensuring that her presence would be felt long before it could be fully acknowledged. In this delicate balance of observation, intervention, and perception management, the widow secured a place not only at the center of the town's social network but also in its collective consciousness, marking the beginning of a narrative that would intertwine her ambition, intellect, and audacity with the destiny of the town itself. The widow's thoughts began to coalesce into a plan, a vision both audacious and terrifying in its clarity. For years, she had observed the subtle hierarchies of the town, noting which families clung to power and which had quietly surrendered to circumstance. She had catalogued grievances, ambitions, and vulnerabilities with meticulous attention, storing each detail as though they were pieces of a puzzle she alone could complete. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky blushed with shades of crimson and violet, she sat at her writing desk, quill in hand, poised over a ledger that was both a record and a map. Her decision, though carefully considered, carried the weight of irrevocability. The townsfolk, with their polite smiles and veiled suspicion, had no inkling of the course she intended to pursue. She would not merely participate in social maneuvering or defend her inherited estates, she would seize influence in ways that challenged long-standing conventions, bending the rules that others had followed unquestioningly for generations. Her mind traced the consequences with exacting precision, alliances would shift, whispers would ignite, and every miscalculation could leave her exposed to ruin. Yet she felt the thrill of control, the intoxicating certainty that each move she made could yield power far beyond what the town had ever seen. In the parlor, the shadows seemed to deepen as if responding to the weight of her contemplation. Candlelight flickered against the walls, casting grotesque reflections from the gilded frames of her ancestors' portraits. Their eyes, once silent witnesses to family triumphs and failures, now seemed to anticipate her actions, a testament to the inheritance of cunning, strategy, and, perhaps, ruthlessness. As she considered her next steps, she recalled the minor acts that had emboldened her over the years, a disputed land sale quietly redirected, a neighbor's accusation subtly discredited, a servant's loyalty carefully secured. These small triumphs had honed her capacity for manipulation, teaching her that influence was a game of patience, observation, and the occasional daring leap. The decision she faced now demanded all of these skills and more. Beyond the walls of her home, the town continued its rhythms, oblivious to the storm quietly gathering in the widow's mind. Market vendors closed their stalls, families lit lamps behind shuttered windows, and church bells tolled, their sound mingling with the distant croak of frogs in the marshes. Every element of the environment, every quiet murmur of nature, seemed charged with significance, as if the world itself acknowledged the gravity of what was about to unfold. She considered the individuals who would be affected by her choices, the prominent families who assumed their influence was unassailable, the clergy who relied on tradition to maintain control, the neighbors who had long whispered about her ambition with a mixture of admiration and fear. Each would be a piece in her intricate design, manipulated through persuasion, intimidation, or carefully planted rumor. The widow's hand hovered over the ledger, tracing the lines that connected resources, relationships, and potential leverage points. Her mind shifted between strategy and foresight, weighing the ethical and practical implications of every action, though her reasoning was tempered by a clear understanding that morality had little place in the pursuit of lasting influence. That night, she made subtle preparations, letters drafted but unsent, visits scheduled to observe reactions, interactions designed to unsettle and probe weaknesses. She orchestrated appearances of compliance while internally rehearsing maneuvers that would realign the town's social landscape. Every gesture, every smile, and every conversation became a calculated step toward her goal. Sleep eluded her, replaced by an acute awareness of time and opportunity. In the quiet hours, she imagined scenarios unfolding with ruthless precision, noting which variables were controllable and which required delicate manipulation. The boundary between contemplation and obsession blurred as the magnitude of her decision pressed upon her, yet she felt no fear, only clarity, purpose, and an unshakable belief in her own capacity to succeed. By dawn, the ledger held not only records but a blueprint, each entry a testament to her understanding of human behavior and social leverage. The sun rose over the plantation, casting long, fractured shadows across the fields, symbolic of the uncertainty and tension now stretching toward the town. The widow moved through the rooms with deliberate calm, gathering letters, reviewing accounts, and reaffirming the alliances she had quietly cultivated. The decision had been made, the consequences would follow, unstoppable and inexorably entwined with every life that intersected with her own. Outside, the magnolia trees stood sentinel, their branches brushing against the wind, as if whispering secrets of the power she was about to wield. The town itself remained unaware that the balance of influence, tradition, and social order was about to be challenged by a widow whose grief had been transformed into strategic ambition. Each step she took that morning was both ordinary and portentous, a movement that would ripple outward in subtle and profound ways. By the time the first neighbors caught sight of her silhouette at the windows, they would sense only composure and propriety, blind to the calculated storm brewing within. And yet, in the quiet recesses of the town, the first stirrings of suspicion, the faintest unease, were already beginning to emerge, as the widow's ominous decision silently set into motion a series of events that would alter the course of lives, reputations, and legacies for years to come. As the widow's plans began to take shape, the town started to sense a subtle shift, though few could articulate exactly what had changed. Late at night, figures moved quietly along the streets, observing windows and doors, whispering to one another with glances full of suspicion. Rumors, at first fragmented and inconsistent, began to coalesce into a murmur that crept through the taverns, marketplaces, and parlor rooms. Neighbors who had once admired the widow's poise and intelligence now found themselves questioning her motives, noting small anomalies in behavior that seemed to hint at something far larger than ordinary social maneuvering. One of the first witnesses was a servant from the widow's household, a young woman with an eye for detail, who noticed letters arriving and departing under the cover of night, the occasional visitor whose presence was never explained, and subtle changes in the household accounts that hinted at influence being quietly redirected. She recounted these details in hushed tones to her confidants, unsure of whether she was imagining conspiracy or observing its unfolding reality. Another witness, a merchant who had dealings with the widow, described the subtle pressures applied during routine transactions, an imperceptible insistence, a glance that suggested expectation, a tone of voice that implied consequences for disobedience. Even the most skeptical townspeople could not entirely dismiss the mounting evidence of her growing influence, though they struggled to identify its source or intent. The narrative of whispers was further amplified by those who sought to protect themselves. Families who had long maintained quiet control of social and economic spheres now felt an unfamiliar tension, the sense that the widow's ambition threatened to disrupt carefully cultivated hierarchies. Conversations in dimly lit parlors were filled with coded warnings and speculative conjectures, each participant cautious not to be overheard, yet driven by the irresistible pull of curiosity and fear. The town's clergy, too, began to note irregularities. Reports of gatherings at odd hours, the presence of outsiders in the widow's home, and subtle challenges to religious and social conventions sparked concern. Some ministers attempted discreet inquiries, visiting parishioners and probing for understanding, only to be met with half-truths, evasions, and the occasional outright denial. The widow, acutely aware of the attention, continued her maneuvers with careful precision, cultivating appearances of normalcy while her influence expanded. Her understanding of human psychology allowed her to anticipate reactions, plant misinformation, and direct the narrative of her own behavior, ensuring that each whisper had multiple possible interpretations. Slowly, the web of witnesses began to form a partial picture. The maid who noticed the clandestine letters, the merchant attuned to the widow's subtle pressures, the neighbor who glimpsed mysterious visitors, all offered fragments of evidence. Separately, these observations seemed trivial, easily dismissed as coincidence or imagination. Together, however, they hinted at a larger pattern, an invisible hand guiding events and shaping perceptions in ways the town could neither fully comprehend nor resist. The atmosphere of suspicion intensified as the widow's presence became synonymous with uncertainty. Children playing in the streets overheard adults murmuring warnings, and casual interactions were colored by the fear of reprisal or social judgment. Each witness carried a piece of the story, yet no one could assemble it completely, leaving an uneasy tension suspended over daily life. In the marketplace, the quiet glances exchanged among neighbors spoke volumes. Gossip spread not only through words but through gestures, silences, and the careful avoidance of certain topics. Those who had once considered themselves secure in their knowledge of the town's social hierarchy now felt vulnerable, aware that their positions were subject to forces they could not name. The widow's reputation, carefully cultivated over years, began to take on a dual character, admiration from some, fear and suspicion from others. The slow accumulation of witnesses and murmurs created a pressure that was both tangible and invisible, a sense that something profound was emerging just beyond perception. As the days passed, the town's collective awareness became sharper. People began to notice subtle patterns, who visited whom, which businesses thrived or faltered under quiet influence, the timing of social gatherings, and the rare moments when the widow's composure slipped, revealing a glimpse of calculated intent. Even those most committed to rational explanation found themselves unsettled by the consistency and precision of these anomalies. The widow's awareness of this growing network of observation allowed her to manipulate it further, exploiting fear and curiosity to reinforce her own position. She orchestrated situations in which witnesses could interpret her actions in multiple ways, ensuring that doubt, intrigue, and anxiety all reinforced her growing power. By the end of this period, the town was alive with whispers, each one carrying the weight of observation, speculation, and unease. The first witnesses had fulfilled their unwitting role, spreading fragments of truth and misdirection alike, creating a lattice of tension that enveloped the widow's world. The stage was now set for further escalation, the slow-burning fire of suspicion and curiosity preparing the town for the dramatic consequences of her ambition, the subtle and relentless spread of influence that would soon touch every corner of their lives. The widow's actions began to openly challenge the conventions that had governed the town for generations. No longer content to operate in the shadows, she started attending social gatherings with an air of deliberate audacity, speaking with confidence on matters that were traditionally reserved for men or for the established elite. Her questions, once polite and deferential, now carried subtle insinuations, testing the boundaries of acceptable discourse. At the church, she raised points during sermons and community meetings that skirted doctrine, hinting at alternate interpretations and questioning long-held moral assumptions. Her defiance was never brazen for spectacle alone, it was calculated, a methodical pushing against the frameworks that maintained social and religious order. Conversations with influential families became arenas of subtle contest, where every compliment or remark was layered with meaning, gauging reactions, planting seeds of doubt, and asserting her presence. Her influence began to ripple through the town, unsettling individuals who had relied on tradition to guide behavior and maintain hierarchy. Clergy, accustomed to unquestioned adherence, found themselves responding to her inquiries with caution, aware that any misstep could embolden her further. In private, she met with select allies, guiding their perception of events and encouraging subtle disruptions in the routines and loyalties of her peers. Even the smallest act, a slight shift in seating at a gathering, a carefully timed comment about property or inheritance, was imbued with strategic significance, testing the limits of social expectation while reinforcing her control over perception. The widow's defiance was particularly evident in her management of the household and the plantation. She implemented policies and made financial decisions that defied convention, prioritizing efficiency, influence, or personal gain over adherence to custom. Servants and staff found themselves navigating new expectations, uncertain of how far her directives would extend and how their compliance or resistance would be judged. Meanwhile, families long accustomed to a predictable social rhythm experienced subtle disruptions, invitations rescinded or redirected, alliances quietly undermined, and influence gradually shifting to favor the widow. Townsfolk began to feel a collective tension, a sense that the familiar rules had loosened, yet no one could articulate precisely where the line had been crossed. The widow's presence at markets, meetings, and social gatherings became a catalyst for speculation and unease. Conversations were interrupted as neighbors attempted to reconcile their admiration for her intelligence with their fear of her audacity. Children overheard adults debating the propriety of her behavior, and even casual exchanges were tinged with subtle caution. Religious authorities, facing the widow's probing questions and unconventional assertions, struggled to maintain authority without inciting open confrontation. Some attempted private counsel, hoping to sway her influence back toward tradition, but she navigated these interactions with tact and precision, refusing to concede or be intimidated. As the defiance continued, alliances among prominent families began to strain. Individuals who had relied on shared adherence to custom now faced uncertainty, unsure whether loyalty or opposition to the widow would yield security or consequence. Gossip flourished, spreading both admiration and apprehension, while her carefully maintained composure allowed her to observe and exploit the evolving dynamics. Even minor events were transformed into instruments of influence. A planned gathering became an opportunity to highlight inconsistencies among rivals, a charitable act demonstrated strategic generosity, and routine social etiquette was leveraged to unsettle those accustomed to unquestioned tradition. The widow's defiance of expectation was mirrored in her appearance, demeanor, and conduct, each element reinforcing the impression of control and authority. Her attire, speech, and posture were chosen to convey both refinement and subtle dominance, creating a persona that was simultaneously familiar and disconcerting to her peers. Over time, the town's collective consciousness became increasingly attuned to her presence, her actions sparking debate, suspicion, and quiet admiration in equal measure. The careful manipulation of perception allowed her to consolidate influence, making each social interaction a calculated step toward greater authority. Even the most entrenched leaders began to acknowledge, privately if not publicly, that her ambitions could not be ignored. The widow's defiance of tradition created a new equilibrium, one in which she was no longer simply a participant in the social order but an architect of its subtle reshaping. Her calculated challenges to convention destabilized the town's hierarchy, leaving observers uncertain, fearful, and fascinated, a combination that amplified her power and set the stage for the deeper psychological and social consequences that would follow. Through each measured action, she asserted not only her presence but the notion that influence and control were no longer dictated solely by lineage or custom, but by strategy, intelligence, and the courage to act against expectation, reshaping the landscape of Southern society in ways that would echo far beyond her immediate sphere. The widow's mind, once disciplined and strategic, began to twist under the weight of her ambitions and the relentless scrutiny of the town. She became increasingly paranoid, convinced that every whisper, glance, and seemingly innocuous comment carried hidden meaning, a subtle challenge to her authority. Night after night, she prowled the corridors of her decaying plantation, imagining conspiracies, replaying conversations, and cataloging perceived slights with a meticulous obsession. Sleep became elusive, replaced by a restless vigilance, a constant awareness that her position was precarious despite the outward display of control. Each decision she had made, once a source of confidence, now seemed fraught with unseen consequences, and she questioned the loyalty of allies who had previously been considered steadfast. Minor mistakes or lapses in judgment were magnified in her mind, becoming signs of inevitable betrayal or failure. The isolation of widowhood, once a source of strength and clarity, transformed into a crucible of psychological strain. Friends and confidants grew cautious, sensing her increasing volatility, while servants moved with quiet anxiety, uncertain when their duties might intersect with her spiraling moods. Her interactions with the townspeople became sharper, tinged with a barely contained edge, a subtle warning that she was not to be underestimated. Even in moments of apparent calm, the widow's internal world was a battlefield of conflicting emotions, fear and exhilaration, guilt and justification, doubt and determination. She scrutinized every gesture, every tone, every expression of those around her, searching for evidence of disloyalty or weakness. This hyper-awareness allowed her to anticipate moves and manipulate outcomes, but it also created a fragile mental state, where reality and suspicion intertwined in unpredictable ways. Rumors of her psychological instability began to circulate, whispered first among servants and then among the townsfolk. Observers noted her sudden absences, the intensity of her stare, the way she lingered over documents and ledgers long after practical necessity had ended. Some attributed these behaviors to grief, others to sheer ambition, but all recognized that the widow was transforming, her mind consumed by the mechanics of power and control. Paranoia coexisted with cunning, producing a dangerous blend of creativity and obsessive calculation. She devised intricate plans to secure loyalty, often testing those around her with subtle manipulations, presenting moral dilemmas, or orchestrating events to gauge reactions. Every encounter became an experiment, every conversation a study in human behavior, and every subtle shift in tone or expression a data point to be interpreted. Her moral compass, already flexible, began to bend further, justified by the perceived necessity of maintaining influence. The line between right and wrong blurred, replaced by a singular metric, effectiveness. Alliances were maintained or severed not by affection or shared values, but by utility, and her capacity for empathy diminished in proportion to her drive for dominance. The psychological toll manifested physically as well. The widow's features, once composed and dignified, grew gaunt and sharp, shadows forming under eyes that had learned to watch relentlessly. Her gestures became more deliberate, her movements calculated, as though even the smallest act could be weaponized or misinterpreted. Her voice carried an intensity that unsettled those who spoke with her, a combination of charm, authority, and barely contained tension. Social gatherings became exercises in mental calculation. She observed the interplay of personalities, noting allegiances, hidden resentment, and ambition, constantly updating her understanding of the human terrain around her. Even minor interactions were catalogued and analyzed, feeding a cycle of vigilance that was both empowering and isolating. As her isolation deepened, she began to perceive threats where none existed, constructing elaborate scenarios in which rivals conspired against her or allies faltered in loyalty. Every rumor, every piece of gossip, every subtle movement in the town became fuel for her calculations, heightening anxiety and sharpening resolve simultaneously. The pressure of maintaining dominance, navigating alliances, and defending against imagined adversaries created a state of constant tension, a psychological tightrope that left little room for genuine rest or human connection. Despite, or perhaps because of, these strains, her strategic abilities remained acute. The widow could anticipate reactions, manipulate perception, and orchestrate events with an almost preternatural insight into human behavior. Her brilliance and instability were intertwined, each amplifying the other. By the time the town fully recognized the scope of her influence, the widow's mind had become both her greatest asset and her most dangerous liability. The careful orchestration of power was inseparable from the growing shadows within, a complex interplay of ambition, fear, and obsession that transformed her into a figure as unpredictable as she was formidable. Within the walls of her plantation, the echoes of her own thoughts seemed to conspire, reinforcing both paranoia and purpose, a relentless mental rhythm that ensured she would neither rest nor relent until every contingency had been considered, every potential threat neutralized, and every opportunity for advantage fully exploited. In this state of heightened psychological tension, the widow became a force of relentless calculation, her intellect sharpened by the pressure of suspicion, her morality subordinated to the singular goal of maintaining control, and her presence an indelible shadow over the town that would long remember both her cunning and her descent into the darker corridors of her own mind. As the widow's influence extended across the town, curiosity and unease prompted outsiders and locals alike to attempt explanations for the growing tension that had begun to permeate daily life. Scholars, journalists, and visiting officials arrived, seeking to document, understand, and, where possible, constrain her actions. Letters and diaries became primary sources, each entry examined for hidden meanings, inconsistencies, or evidence of manipulation. The townsfolk, driven by both fear and fascination, contributed their own observations, sometimes contradictory, sometimes corroborative, but all adding layers of complexity to an already intricate picture. Attempts to decipher the widow's strategy were hindered by her skill in crafting appearances. Every public gesture, every social interaction, was calculated to convey both compliance and dominance, ensuring that observers could derive multiple interpretations depending on their perspective and bias. Scholars debated her motives, some attributing her behavior to grief and the pressures of widowhood, others to an innate cunning and a desire for social control. Clergy consulted privately, attempting to assess whether her actions were morally objectionable or merely unconventional, while public discourse oscillated between admiration for her intelligence and alarm at her audacity. Attempts to document her influence often yielded more questions than answers. Journalists, noting her careful management of perception, struggled to construct coherent narratives. Reports of clandestine gatherings, subtle coercion, and shifts in alliances were juxtaposed against her impeccable social conduct and visible charitable acts, creating a paradox that confounded rational analysis. Local families, particularly those who had long considered themselves socially secure, sought to understand the mechanisms by which she maintained power. Meetings and private conversations were convened, strategies considered, and interventions proposed, yet few were willing to confront her directly, fearing reprisal or social embarrassment. Even when tangible evidence, ledgers, letters, and property records, was available, interpretation remained contested. A financial transaction might be viewed as a legitimate investment by one observer, while another perceived manipulation or coercion. Every minor action of the widows became a potential clue, a piece of an expansive puzzle that no one could assemble with certainty. Visitors from neighboring towns contributed to the growing complexity, offering their perspectives, rumors, and anecdotal reports. Their observations often conflicted with those of local witnesses, creating a dense web of narratives that intertwined truth, speculation, and misperception. Within the widow's household, attempts to uncover her motives met subtle obstruction. Servants were loyal yet cautious, providing information selectively, aware that misinterpretation could carry consequences. Her careful orchestration of daily routines ensured that outsiders could observe only fragments of her activities, each carefully framed to reinforce ambiguity. Even scientific minds, applying emerging theories of psychology and sociology, struggled to account for her influence. They examined social patterns, human behavior, and economic decision-making, hoping to derive rational explanations, only to encounter the limits of empirical reasoning in the face of human cunning and unpredictability. Attempts to categorize her behavior, whether as shrewd, manipulative, or morally corrupt, proved unsatisfactory, as every action could be interpreted in multiple, sometimes contradictory, ways. The town itself became a laboratory of observation, its citizens unwitting participants in a complex study of power, perception, and social dynamics. Each response, from the smallest gesture to the loudest denunciation, offered data, yet the conclusions remained elusive. As weeks and months passed, the widow continued her careful orchestration, aware of the scrutiny yet moving with unflappable composure. Each attempt to unravel her strategy only highlighted her sophistication, revealing the intricate web of relationships, obligations, and subtle pressures she had cultivated over years. The result was a town both fascinated and bewildered, its understanding of events partial, fragmented, and filtered through layers of bias and assumption. Attempts to explain her behavior created tension between rational thought and suspicion, belief and observation, as the town oscillated between admiration, fear, and confusion. Outsiders left with fragmented stories and unanswered questions, while locals lived in a state of heightened awareness, constantly monitoring shifts in power, alliances, and influence. By the end of this period, it was clear that the widow's control had not only endured scrutiny but had been strengthened by it. The very attempts to analyze, critique, or counteract her influence were anticipated, incorporated into her strategies, and leveraged to reinforce her dominance. The mystery deepened, as observers increasingly recognized that understanding the widow was not a matter of gathering information alone, but of comprehending an intelligence that operated several steps ahead, a mind attuned to the subtleties of human behavior, capable of turning observation into manipulation, and capable of remaining one step beyond even the most determined attempts at analysis. The town, scholars, and visitors alike came to understand a singular truth: the widow's power was as enigmatic as it was undeniable, a force defined not merely by wealth or lineage, but by an extraordinary ability to orchestrate perception, influence outcomes, and defy conventional understanding, leaving all who sought to unravel her in awe, suspicion, and enduring uncertainty. The widow's carefully constructed web of influence began to unravel, not through sudden confrontation, but through the slow, inevitable erosion of loyalty, trust, and social alignment. Allies who had once supported her for mutual benefit now questioned her judgment, perceiving the subtle cracks in her authority that had long been obscured by her meticulous orchestration of appearances. Meetings with prominent families, once opportunities to consolidate power, became arenas of tension and veiled opposition. The widow sensed the shift before it fully materialized, feeling the absence of previously dependable voices, the hesitation in responses, and the faint glances that hinted at disagreement or resentment. Even the servants, those closest to her daily life, began to act with caution, their obedience tempered by concern for self-preservation. The plantation, once a symbol of her enduring legacy and command, reflected the state of her social position. Rooms that had been meticulously maintained showed signs of neglect, fields were cultivated less with precision than out of necessity, the air itself seemed heavier, tinged with the weight of isolation. Visitors were fewer, letters unanswered, and alliances that had required only subtle nudges began to crumble under pressure. As her power waned, the townspeople's perception shifted dramatically. Where once there had been awe and fear, now there was scrutiny and, in some cases, open suspicion. Observers who had attempted to unravel her strategies noted inconsistencies, erratic behavior, and moments of vulnerability that had been previously invisible. The widow's psychological state mirrored this external collapse. Her once sharp and unyielding mind was now burdened by self-doubt and constant anticipation of betrayal. Paranoia, already a subtle companion, became a persistent force, shaping her interactions, decisions, and perceptions. She scrutinized every gesture of those around her, interpreting silence as dissent and minor errors as acts of subversion. The isolation became both physical and emotional. Conversations dwindled, and the comfort of social rituals no longer offered reassurance. Instead, they became tests of loyalty and subtle traps that could reveal hidden allegiances. In solitude, she wrestled with the consequences of her ambition, recognizing the fragility of the power she had built and the difficulty of maintaining control in a world increasingly resistant to her influence. Attempts to assert authority met resistance or indifference, and the carefully cultivated image of dominance faltered under the weight of cumulative challenges. Public appearances became exercises in careful navigation, each interaction measured for potential threats or missteps, yet even her precision could not fully compensate for the erosion of trust. The psychological impact of this collapse was profound. The widow vacillated between determination to reclaim her position and resignation to the inevitable unraveling of her influence. Every plan seemed subject to scrutiny, every ally a potential adversary, and every routine interaction carried hidden significance. Sleep became intermittent, meals neglected, and the once vibrant household now felt hollow, echoing with absence and uncertainty. Isolation amplified the intensity of her calculations. She spent hours reviewing letters, accounts, and social arrangements, seeking patterns that might restore control, yet every discovery revealed additional vulnerabilities. Attempts to manipulate perception became increasingly desperate, as she sought to maintain influence even while recognizing its fragility. Rumors spread more rapidly in her absence of clear control, with the townsfolk eager to fill gaps in understanding with conjecture. Each whisper, each misinterpreted gesture, reinforced the sense that her authority was slipping and that the social equilibrium she had meticulously managed was disintegrating. The widow's relationship with the town became a delicate balance of avoidance and assertion, as she maneuvered to protect what remained of her influence while confronting the stark reality of declining loyalty. The plantation itself, once a stage for her strategic orchestration, became a reflection of solitude and tension, each empty room, shuttered window, and neglected corridor a testament to the collapse of her network of control. By the end of this period, the widow had become both a figure of fascination and caution. Her brilliance and ambition remained undeniable, yet the social, psychological, and practical structures she had relied upon were fractured, leaving her isolated within the very world she had sought to command. The town, sensing the shift, adjusted to her reduced presence, some retreating from engagement, others emboldened to reclaim influence once under her sway. The widow, now acutely aware of her precarious position, continued to observe, calculate, and adapt, but the tension between her ambition and her isolation created a profound vulnerability, marking a pivotal moment in her story, a convergence of power, consequence, and solitude that would define the final chapters of her influence. In the aftermath of the widow's decline, the town settled into a fragile equilibrium, haunted by the reverberations of her ambition and the memories of her relentless pursuit of power. Families once aligned with her influence scrambled to re-establish their social positions, cautious of overreach, yet aware that the widow's shadow lingered over every interaction and decision. Streets and marketplaces bore the marks of tension long past, conversations often punctuated by hesitation, subtle glances, and half-formed warnings. The plantation, now quiet and partially abandoned, stood as both monument and warning, its decaying grandeur a visible reminder of ambition unchecked and influence contested. Stories of her actions circulated in hushed tones, embroidered with exaggeration or moral commentary, creating a mythology around her presence that blurred fact and speculation. Children who had witnessed small fragments of her assertiveness and intimidation carried the stories forward, their interpretations shaped by fear, admiration, and imagination. Even decades later, the elders of the town would recount her deeds with a mixture of reverence and caution, cautioning against underestimating cleverness, audacity, or the capacity for calculated ruthlessness. The widow's former allies, having survived her manipulations, found themselves navigating a complex landscape of restored autonomy and lingering suspicion. Trust, once casually extended, was now filtered through lessons learned from her influence, creating a society more attentive to subtle cues, hidden agendas, and the consequences of inattention. Her ability to command attention, manipulate perception, and shape social outcomes became the subject of reflection, both formal and informal. Town meetings, church councils, and family gatherings included subtle nods to her methods, discussions of strategy, and acknowledgments of her capacity to orchestrate events in ways that exceeded common expectation. Even those who had actively opposed her acknowledged a certain respect for her intelligence, strategic acumen, and unwavering focus, a grudging admiration tempered by fear. The silence surrounding the widow was as meaningful as the stories that persisted. Certain details, behaviors, and interactions were left unspoken, forming a tapestry of omission that preserved her mystique while allowing the town to move forward cautiously. In these unspoken spaces, imagination flourished, and the lines between reality and legend blurred, creating a narrative that was part historical fact, part folklore. The fear she instilled became a cultural touchstone, a cautionary tale for generations that followed. Children were reminded that ambition without regard for consequence could disrupt social harmony, and that intelligence and cunning, when combined with resolve and ruthlessness, could leave a mark impossible to erase. Over time, the widow's influence extended beyond immediate memory, entering the collective consciousness of the region. Her name evoked reactions that ranged from awe to apprehension, an ever-present reminder that the past could shape behavior, expectations, and social norms long after the individual was no longer present. Local historians and chroniclers began to compile accounts, combining letters, records, and oral histories to piece together her story. These records, however, were inevitably colored by interpretation, bias, and the passage of time, ensuring that her true motives and methods remained elusive. The combination of lingering fear and selective memory created a duality: the town both remembered and forgot, simultaneously preserving her impact and allowing themselves to move past the direct consequences of her actions. Even the natural landscape, the magnolia groves, the decaying fences, and the fields once tended under her supervision, seemed imbued with traces of her presence, silent witnesses to ambition, strategy, and the quiet assertion of influence. Visitors to the region remarked on the tension that lingered in social spaces, the subtle caution embedded in communal rituals, and the stories that always seemed to circle back to the widow, illustrating that her legacy was not simply in what she achieved, but in the psychological and cultural footprint she left behind. Scholars and casual observers alike noted the enduring patterns, heightened vigilance, careful observation of social hierarchy, and the subtle negotiation of power in everyday interactions, all of which had been shaped or accelerated by her interventions. The widow's influence, though no longer active, remained a force that shaped perception, expectation, and behavior. Her absence did not equate to erasure, rather, it created a vacuum filled with memory, caution, and a persistent sense of tension that reminded the town that power, once exercised with precision and audacity, leaves a long shadow. Over time, the lessons embedded in her story became codified into the town's culture, folklore, and collective memory, ensuring that the widow's presence, both literal and symbolic, continued to influence the choices, fears, and ambitions of those who came after her. The legacy of fear and silence was complete, woven into the very fabric of daily life, an enduring testament to the consequences of relentless ambition, the fragility of trust, and the subtle but profound ways in which a single individual could alter the course of an entire community for generations. Scholars, chroniclers, and curious observers long after the widow's passing debated the true extent and nature of her influence. Her actions, meticulously recorded in letters, ledgers, and fragmented diaries, offered tantalizing glimpses into her strategies, yet no comprehensive understanding ever emerged. Some historians argued that her ambition had been a necessary assertion of agency in a society that constrained women's power, framing her maneuvers as clever, calculated, and ultimately visionary. Others suggested darker motivations, a hunger for control that transcended morality, a psychological compulsion to dominate social structures at any cost. Attempts to categorize her as either hero or villain proved futile, her complexity defied binary interpretation. Psychologists and social theorists examined the patterns of her interactions, considering the subtle manipulations, the cultivation of loyalty, and the strategic dissemination of misinformation as case studies in human behavior, social dynamics, and the psychology of power. The widow's ability to anticipate reactions, to exploit weaknesses, and to manage perception became a subject of fascination, illustrating both the possibilities and the perils of strategic influence in tightly knit communities. Folklore, too, filled the gaps left by historical record. Stories of clandestine meetings, cryptic letters, and seemingly impossible outcomes circulated for decades, blending fact and speculation into legends that hinted at her uncanny foresight and inexorable will. Some claimed she had anticipated entire events years in advance, orchestrating outcomes that seemed almost supernatural in their precision, while skeptics dismissed such tales as exaggeration or the natural embellishment of oral storytelling. The town itself remained a living testament to her legacy, with social behaviors and cautious interactions still reflecting the patterns she had shaped. Even after the passage of time, individuals unconsciously followed the protocols, allegiances, and hierarchies subtly influenced by her, demonstrating the lasting imprint of her strategies on communal life. Attempts to reconcile historical records with oral histories often revealed contradictions. Letters described calculated decisions and deliberate manipulations, while eyewitness accounts, filtered through memory and perception, emphasized fear, awe, or rumor. Reconciling these narratives became a challenge for anyone attempting to distill truth from the widow's complex social web. Debates emerged regarding the morality of her actions. Was she merely a product of her environment, using intelligence and opportunity to navigate a restrictive social landscape, or did her ambition cross ethical boundaries, exploiting fear and manipulating loyalty for personal gain? No consensus emerged, leaving historians and ethicists to ponder the ambiguity inherent in human behavior and the difficulty of applying absolute judgment to complex circumstances. The widow's psychological profile, reconstructed through letters, diaries, and witness recollections, revealed a mind both brilliant and volatile, capable of extraordinary insight yet subject to paranoia, obsession, and emotional strain. Analysts considered how her isolation, grief, and ambition interacted to produce both her remarkable achievements and her eventual vulnerabilities. Modern interpretations applied sociological and anthropological frameworks, exploring how gender, class, and historical context shaped the opportunities available to her and the responses of those around her. Her story became a lens through which the dynamics of power, influence, and social expectation in the postbellum South could be examined, offering insights into both individual agency and communal reaction. Even contemporary visitors and scholars approached her legacy with caution, aware that the widow's life was layered with complexity, contradiction, and uncertainty. The combination of documented actions, fragmentary records, and oral tradition ensured that any interpretation remained provisional, always subject to revision as new evidence, perspective, or analytical approach emerged. Questions persisted: had her manipulations fundamentally reshaped the town's social order? Did her influence extend beyond immediate interactions to create lasting behavioral norms? Were the stories of her foresight and cunning exaggerated, or did they capture a genuine mastery of human psychology? Each answer suggested further inquiry, revealing the inexhaustible depth of her impact. The widow's life, therefore, resisted finality. She remained an enigma, a figure whose deeds could be analyzed endlessly yet never fully comprehended. Her brilliance, ambition, and psychological complexity created a legacy that was at once tangible and elusive, leaving scholars, townsfolk, and storytellers to grapple with the tension between historical record and narrative interpretation. In the end, the final theories, while compelling, offered no closure. Each insight uncovered new questions, and every hypothesis illuminated additional uncertainties. The widow's influence was both enduring and inscrutable, a case study in the intricate interplay of personality, circumstance, and social dynamics, reminding all who studied her that power, memory, and ambition leave traces that resist simplification, interpretation, or definitive conclusion. Decades after the widow's presence had faded from daily life, the town continued to carry the echoes of her influence, subtle yet persistent, woven into the fabric of its collective memory. Streets, markets, and social halls bore the weight of unwritten rules, patterns of interaction, and cautious diplomacy that reflected the long-lasting effects of her strategic maneuvers. Families still referenced her indirectly, employing her story as both cautionary tale and moral example, a benchmark for ambition, cunning, and the consequences of unchecked determination. The magnolia trees that lined the avenues seemed to whisper secrets of her past, their shadows dancing across windows and porches like silent reminders of the calculated authority she had exercised. Elders recounted events to younger generations with care, omitting details or exaggerating elements to ensure that her legacy retained both mystery and moral weight. The stories were rarely consistent, shifting subtly depending on the teller's perspective, yet each version reinforced the notion that the widow's presence had altered the town in ways that persisted long after her passing. Scholars who visited the town found themselves fascinated not only by the historical records, letters, ledgers, and personal accounts, but by the intangible effects she had left on social behavior and communal expectation. They observed patterns of cautious speech, strategic alliances, and unspoken hierarchies that seemed to echo her influence, demonstrating that her ability to shape perception and behavior extended far beyond her lifetime. Even religious institutions reflected the widow's lingering impact. Sermons occasionally referenced lessons of caution and integrity, indirectly invoking her story as an example of ambition both admirable and dangerous. Clergy and parishioners alike acknowledged, often in whispered tones, the subtle power of intellect combined with audacity, and how such forces could unsettle social equilibrium. Within households, her influence manifested in private behavior and interpersonal negotiation. Children grew up aware that social observation, strategic thought, and the careful weighing of words and gestures were essential skills, lessons imparted by the stories of her life. Families who had been directly affected by her actions maintained cautious vigilance, mindful of the consequences that ambition could impose on loyalty, reputation, and opportunity. The widow's former estate became a locus of fascination and apprehension. Though partially decayed, it stood as a physical testament to her life and strategy, a structure that both inspired awe and evoked unease. Visitors and townsfolk approached with reverence, noting the meticulous construction, the remnants of carefully arranged gardens, and the echoes of social gatherings long past. Over time, her story transcended mere biography, entering the realm of legend and local folklore. Elements of her life were retold with embellishment, her foresight, cunning, and audacity magnified in ways that blurred the lines between historical fact and narrative creation. Some tales emphasized her brilliance and shrewdness, others her ruthlessness and manipulative skill, yet all contributed to a cultural memory that resisted erasure. The psychological legacy of her presence was evident in the way residents navigated social interactions. People measured words, gauged expressions, and calculated actions with an awareness, subtle but enduring, of her methods. Patterns of influence and observation, cultivated under her guidance or imprinted through experience, continued to shape communal dynamics long after she was gone. Even in moments of apparent normalcy, her shadow lingered, a reminder that individuals who wield intellect, ambition, and strategic insight can leave effects far more lasting than tangible power alone. Oral histories, scholarly research, and local myth combined to preserve a complex portrait, the widow as strategist, manipulator, visionary, and cautionary figure. Each retelling served both to educate and to instill a sense of vigilance, illustrating the enduring interplay between human behavior, social structure, and personal ambition. The town, aware of her absence yet influenced by her legacy, continued to operate within frameworks subtly shaped by her decisions, negotiations, and interventions. Her story became a lens through which residents understood opportunity, risk, and social consequence, informing decisions from property management to alliances, public behavior to private negotiation. Even when generations had passed, the widow remained present in memory, shaping attitudes, guiding caution, and inspiring both admiration and fear. The persistence of her influence underscored the power of intellect and determination, revealing how one individual's strategic actions can resonate across time, subtly yet profoundly altering the patterns of human interaction and communal life. Her legacy, therefore, was not confined to records or recollection alone. It existed in the behaviors, choices, and cautionary practices of a town that had been forever altered by her presence, a testament to the enduring shadows cast by a life marked by ambition, insight, and unrelenting determination. Long after the widow had receded from the town's immediate consciousness, her presence continued to resonate, both as a cautionary tale and as a testament to the enduring power of calculated ambition. The streets she had once navigated with precision carried the memory of her steps. Markets and social halls retained an air of vigilance, as if the echoes of her influence lingered in the gestures and decisions of those who followed. Families that had been her contemporaries spoke in hushed tones about her, passing on fragments of her story that blended observation, speculation, and legend. Children grew up with tales of a woman whose intellect and audacity reshaped the contours of their community, an almost mythic figure who commanded attention even in absence. Her former allies, those who had benefited from her guidance or feared her intervention, continued to operate with caution, aware that the habits and patterns she had established persisted in subtle, often imperceptible ways. The widow's ability to manipulate perception and orchestrate outcomes had left a cultural imprint, conditioning the town's citizens to weigh words, assess motives, and anticipate strategic behavior in social interactions. Scholars and historians who studied the region often remarked on the unusually nuanced social dynamics, recognizing the widow's influence as a pivotal force in shaping these patterns. They traced economic decisions, family alliances, and social hierarchies back to her interventions, noting how even minor actions produced long-term ripple effects. In reconstructing her life, researchers faced challenges. Documents had been lost, letters destroyed, and eyewitness accounts blurred by time. Oral histories, while rich in detail and vivid anecdote, carried the distortions of imagination and selective memory. Yet these very distortions amplified her legend, transforming her from a mere historical actor into an enduring symbol of strategy, ambition, and the human capacity to assert control over circumstance. Psychologists examining her actions posthumously emphasized the interplay of genius and vulnerability. The widow's brilliance lay not merely in her intellect, but in her capacity for observation, anticipation, and manipulation of social systems. Her vulnerabilities, grief, paranoia, and the psychological toll of isolation, were inseparable from her achievements, suggesting that her influence was inseparable from the intensity of her lived experience. The town itself became a living laboratory for examining the effects of her legacy. Decisions in civic councils, social gatherings, and family interactions were shaped by a cautious attentiveness that had become habitual. Individuals adjusted behavior based on a nuanced understanding of precedent, anticipating the type of strategic thinking she had once employed. Even as generations passed, the patterns established by the widow endured, a subtle yet persistent influence on social cohesion, hierarchy, and perception. Folklore and legend grew alongside historical record. Tales of her foresight, cunning, and occasional ruthlessness were embellished in ways that made her both larger than life and psychologically complex. Some accounts spoke of her ability to foresee events years in advance, orchestrating outcomes that seemed improbable or impossible to her contemporaries. Others recounted her personal struggles, the restless nights, the obsessive calculations, the strain of maintaining influence in a community resistant to domination, adding depth and humanity to the legend. The widow's estate, now partially in ruins, served as a physical testament to her life. The rooms she had once navigated with precision were shadowed and silent, yet the patterns of her influence remained evident: gardens tended with care, corridors arranged for observation, spaces designed to maximize control and communication. Visitors to the property felt a palpable sense of presence, an uncanny awareness of her lingering influence, as if the very architecture reflected her intentions and personality. Even the natural landscape bore her imprint. Magnolia trees she had planted, paths she had designed, and fields she had managed all served as markers of a mind attuned to control and legacy. Seasonal changes, wind through the trees, and shifting light across the property seemed to echo the meticulous rhythms of her life, reminding observers that her impact extended beyond social interactions into the very environment she had inhabited. Generations of townsfolk adapted to her absence, yet their collective behavior bore subtle traces of the widow's strategies. Caution in speech, attentiveness to hierarchy, and the careful observation of social cues became ingrained habits, illustrating the profound psychological and cultural legacy she had left behind. Even local institutions, churches, markets, and civic bodies, retained structural and procedural influences reminiscent of her interventions, shaping behavior long after the direct consequences of her ambition had faded. Her story became a lens through which the interplay of individual agency and social dynamics could be explored. Anthropologists, sociologists, and historians examined her life to understand the mechanisms by which one person could alter social structures, influence perception, and leave enduring marks on communal behavior. They noted that the widow's ability to observe, anticipate, and manipulate outcomes was inseparable from her psychological intensity, her awareness of human nature, and her mastery of social networks. The duality of her legacy, fear and admiration, caution and inspiration, provided insight into the complex ways ambition and intelligence interact with social and environmental contexts. Even in the moral imagination of the town, the widow persisted. She represented both the dangers of unchecked ambition and the potential for individual agency to challenge expectation, reshape outcomes, and assert influence beyond apparent limitations. Parents used her story to instruct children on strategy, caution, and vigilance. Community leaders referenced her example to illustrate both prudence and the consequences of miscalculation. In these ways, she remained an active presence in the ethical and psychological frameworks of successive generations. In contemporary reflection, the widow's life is understood not only as a sequence of historical events but as a case study in human behavior, influence, and legacy. Her brilliance, audacity, and psychological complexity illuminate the nuanced interplay between personal ambition and communal response, demonstrating how one individual's actions can reverberate across time, shaping culture, behavior, and memory. The widow's shadows endure in the town's collective consciousness, in the architecture of her estate, in social patterns that persist across generations, and in the stories that continue to circulate in both oral tradition and historical record. Her life, simultaneously enigmatic and instructive, serves as a perpetual reminder that ambition, intelligence, and strategy leave traces that cannot easily be erased. Even decades or centuries later, the careful observer senses the presence of her calculated influence, the weight of her decisions, and the echoes of her psychological intensity. The widow's story illustrates the convergence of human intellect, ambition, and social dynamics, leaving behind a complex, layered legacy that endures in both tangible and intangible ways. Her life remains a testament to the extraordinary impact one person can have on a community, a culture, and the memory of those who follow, a haunting example of how power, perception, and ambition can extend far beyond immediate circumstances, shaping thought, behavior, and social interaction for generations to come. In the end, the widow's enduring shadows serve as both a warning and an inspiration, a reminder that influence, once exercised with precision and audacity, leaves indelible marks on the world, and that the echoes of ambition, carefully calculated and relentlessly pursued, can resonate across time, shaping lives, stories, and communities in ways impossible to fully measure or contain.